Problems at their core do not exist independently in the world around us. They are entirely creations of the mind, products of our thoughts and perceptions. Take any situation traffic, an argument, or even a career setback, and strip away the mental commentary. What remains? Just events, occurrences, things as they are. It is the mind that steps in and labels these moments as problems, spinning them into sources of frustration, anxiety, or fear. This labeling happens because we carry within us a constant stream of judgments and expectations. We measure everything against an internal idea of how life should unfold, and when reality doesn't align with these expectations, the mind declares this is wrong. This is a problem. Yet this declaration is entirely subjective. What one person sees as a problem, another may view as an opportunity, or even as something insignificant. The difference lies not in the situation itself, but in how it is mentally framed. The mind, in its endless activity, tends to magnify its creations. A small inconvenience can be blown into a major obstacle through the stories we tell ourselves about it. What if this gets worse? What will people think? Why does this always happen to me? These narratives, constructed entirely within the mind, add layers of complexity to something that, on its own, may have been simple or even neutral. Ultimately, problems are not an inherent part of life. They emerge when the mind resists what is happening, clinging to an idea of how things should be instead of embracing how things are. In this way, the mind creates not just the problem, but the struggle that accompanies it, pulling us further away from the peace that comes from simply being present. Problems take shape when reality fails to match the expectations we impose upon it. Expectations act as mental blueprints outlining how we believe situations, people, or even life itself should unfold. When the real world deviates from these carefully constructed plans, the mind labels this mismatch as a problem. Yet the so-called problem is not in the external situation, but in the gap between what is and what we think should be. This dynamic plays out constantly. We expect people to behave in certain ways, and when they don't, we feel frustrated. We set goals and timelines for ourselves, and when things don't proceed as planned, we experience disappointment or stress. Even nature, which operates entirely outside human control, becomes a source of problems when it doesn't align with our expectations. Rain on a planned sunny day, traffic when we're in a hurry, or unexpected delays in a carefully orchestrated schedule. The deeper issue lies not in the events themselves, but in our attachment to these expectations. They create rigid boundaries in a world that is inherently fluid and unpredictable. By insisting that life conform to these mental constructs, we set ourselves up for a constant tug of war with reality. The more tightly we hold on to our expectations, the more acutely we feel their absence when life moves in a different direction. Furthermore, expectations often go unnoticed, operating silently in the background until they're unmet. It's in these moments of dissonance that they become visible, manifesting as dissatisfaction or even suffering. Yet this suffering is entirely self-generated, a result of resisting what is rather than embracing it. When we step back and observe, we realize that life itself has no inherent obligation to align with our expectations. The unfolding of events simply is neither good nor bad until the mind steps in to measure and judge. Letting go of these expectations doesn't mean abandoning hope or aspiration. It means loosening our grip on the need for control and allowing life to unfold as it will. In doing so, the very concept of a problem begins to dissolve. The gap between is and ought is where much of our discomfort and frustration arise. Life as it unfolds is a continuous stream of events, neither good nor bad in itself. Yet we constantly impose a mental framework over reality, measuring what is happening against what we believe ought to happen. This comparison creates a tension, a sense that something is missing, wrong, or out of place. Consider a simple moment like waiting in line. The reality standing still while time passes is neutral. But the mind steps in, crafting an expectation: I shouldn't have to wait this long, or this process ought to be faster. Suddenly the experience becomes a source of irritation, not because of the waiting itself, but because of the gap between the reality of waiting and the imagined scenario where things move swiftly. This gap doesn't only apply to small everyday situations. It extends to larger aspects of life, our relationships, careers, and personal achievements. People often feel unhappy or unfulfilled because they compare their current reality to an idealized version of how they think life should look. These ideals might be influenced by societal norms, personal ambitions, or comparisons to others, but they are all constructs of the mind, not reflections of what actually is. The tension between is and ought keeps us perpetually striving, resisting and feeling as though life is out of alignment. But this misalignment exists only in thought, not in reality, when the mind lets go of its oughts and meets life as it is. The gap closes, and with it the unnecessary struggle fades away. In nature, obstacles are not seen as problems, they are simply part of the flow of existence. A river encountering a boulder doesn't stop to lament or resist. It doesn't grumble, "Why is this rock in my way?" Instead, it adjusts seamlessly, finding its way around, over, or through the obstruction. The river's flow continues, unchanged in its purpose, because it doesn't attach meaning or resistance to what it encounters. Similarly, the trees in a forest adapt effortlessly to the conditions they face. A tree doesn't complain if sunlight is blocked by a taller neighbor. It grows toward whatever light is available, bending and twisting as needed. The wind, when it meets resistance, doesn't see it as a problem. It merely shifts direction, adjusting its path without hesitation or judgment. This lack of resistance stems from the fact that nature doesn't separate itself from its surroundings. Everything in nature is interconnected, moving in harmony with the larger whole. Challenges are not seen as interruptions, but as integral parts of the process. A storm is not an enemy to be defeated. It is an expression of the same forces that create calm weather. Humans, on the other hand, often create problems out of obstacles by resisting them. When faced with a challenge, we label it as unfair or unnecessary, and in doing so, we distance ourselves from the natural flow of life. But if we observe nature closely, we see that obstacles are not barriers. They are opportunities for growth, adaptation, and transformation. They are not separate from life, but an essential part of it, shaping and defining the journey without judgment or complaint. The stories we tell ourselves are powerful tools, but they can also magnify and distort the challenges we face, turning minor inconveniences into overwhelming problems. Our minds are storytelling machines, constantly narrating events and experiences in ways that amplify their significance. The moment something happens that doesn't align with our expectations or desires, the mind begins to weave a narrative around it. This is unfair, it says, or this always happens to me. And with every repetition of the story, the issue becomes larger, more entrenched, and seemingly more impossible to resolve. For example, if you're running late for an appointment and hit traffic, the initial frustration is natural. But then the mind kicks in with stories: "I'll be late again. I'll ruin this opportunity. People will be upset with me." The event itself, the traffic, remains just a temporary situation. But the mind layers on a series of judgments, creating a spiral of anxiety and stress. Suddenly, the delay becomes a symbol of everything that is wrong, every failure, every missed chance, all wrapped up into one moment. These stories are not reflections of reality, but rather constructions of the mind. They arise from our beliefs, fears, and past experiences. When we face a challenge, the mind often resorts to familiar narratives, such as feeling like a victim, fearing rejection, or expecting disaster, which intensify the emotional reaction. In truth, the situation itself may not be as dire as it seems. It's the stories we tell ourselves that transform a simple inconvenience into a heavy burden. When we step back from these stories and observe the situation without judgment, the problem often shrinks back into its rightful size. A difficult conversation, for instance, might seem daunting if we imagine it spiraling into conflict. But if we simply focus on the conversation itself without layering on the expectations or assumptions, the reality is often far less threatening. The stories we create about an issue can cloud our ability to see it clearly, and in doing so, they prevent us from responding to it in a way that is grounded in reality. If we can learn to drop the unnecessary stories, to experience life moment by moment without the constant interpretation and amplification, we may find that the so-called problems we face are not nearly as large or insurmountable as we imagined. Suffering, in its deepest sense, doesn't arise from external circumstances, but from the way we resist those circumstances. Life by its very nature is full of fluctuations, joys and sorrows, gains and losses, certainty and uncertainty. These changes are inevitable, like the seasons. But it's not the change itself that causes suffering, it's our resistance to that change. When we encounter something unpleasant or unwanted, whether it's pain, failure, or a difficult emotion, the instinctive reaction is often to push against it, to reject it, to wish it away. This resistance is what creates suffering. Imagine for a moment the sensation of physical pain. The body feels discomfort, perhaps a sharp ache or a throbbing pulse. Pain, as a raw experience, is simply a sensation, something that arises and fades. However, it is not just the sensation that we react to, but the mind's response to it. The mind says, this is bad, or I don't want this, and in that moment of resistance, the experience of pain is intensified. We fight against it, become frustrated, and even resentful of it, which makes the discomfort linger longer than it might have if we had simply allowed it to pass without resistance. The same can be said for emotional pain. When we feel sadness, anger, or fear, the natural instinct is often to push those emotions away, to avoid them, or to judge ourselves for feeling them. I shouldn't feel this way, the mind insists, or this shouldn't be happening. But in resisting the emotion, we prolong it, feeding it with our judgments and attempts to control it. We become entangled in our own discomfort, and the emotion seems to grow more powerful, more all-encompassing. Suffering also arises when we resist what is happening in our lives. We often have a picture in our minds of how life should unfold, how our career should progress, how our relationships should look, how our health should be. When life doesn't meet these expectations, we resist, trying to force things into a shape that aligns with our desires. We create suffering by refusing to accept the present moment as it is, by refusing to acknowledge that life, in all its unpredictability, is unfolding perfectly, even if it doesn't match the plan we've created in our minds. Resistance, in its essence, is a form of control, a desire to mold life into something it isn't. But life is fluid, ever-changing, and beyond our control. When we surrender to what is, when we stop fighting against the flow of events, we allow ourselves to experience life fully without the extra burden of resistance. It's not that we become passive or indifferent, but rather we become participants, not adversaries, in the dance of life. When we cease resisting, we free ourselves from unnecessary suffering, and the things that once caused pain or frustration begin to lose their power over us. The ego, in its most basic form, is the mental construct that defines who we believe ourselves to be. It shapes our identity, our sense of self, and creates a boundary between me and the rest of the world. While this sense of self is useful for navigating daily life and social interactions, it also has a tendency to narrow our perception and limit how we experience the world around us. The ego's primary function is to protect and maintain this sense of separation, but in doing so, it confines our awareness and understanding. When we identify too strongly with the ego, we begin to see ourselves as distinct, isolated beings separate from other people, from nature, and from the larger universe. This sense of separation creates a rigid framework through which we filter our experiences. The world becomes divided into categories. This is mine, that is yours. This is good, that is bad. This is us, and that is them. We start to measure everything in relation to ourselves, our wants, our fears, our desires, and our anxieties, and lose the ability to see the interconnectedness of all things. For example, if someone criticizes us, the ego reacts strongly, interpreting the criticism as a direct attack on its identity. The reaction isn't just a response to the words, but to the perceived threat to the ego's carefully constructed sense of self. The result is a narrowed view of the situation, where we focus on defending our image rather than understanding the broader context or the other person's perspective. The ego keeps us locked in a limited, self-referential bubble, making it difficult to see things from a wider, more inclusive point of view. Similarly, when we are consumed by ego, we tend to view the world through the lens of our past experiences and preconceived notions. We develop filters that distort reality based on our beliefs, biases, and conditioning. We might encounter someone from a different culture or background, but instead of engaging with them openly, we interpret them through the lens of our own worldview, often with misunderstanding or judgment. The ego, in its attempt to maintain control, creates mental shortcuts that prevent us from seeing people and situations as they truly are, uncolored by our past. The ego also limits our capacity for true empathy. When we view others as separate from ourselves, we fail to recognize that their experiences, joys, and struggles are deeply interconnected with our own. We may feel compassion in moments of crisis, but in everyday interactions, the ego often keeps us focused on our own needs, desires, and insecurities, hindering our ability to truly connect with others. Moreover, the ego has a tendency to view the world as a collection of objects to be possessed or manipulated, rather than as a dynamic web of relationships. We see things as resources or challenges to be overcome, rather than as living expressions of the same energy that flows through us. This perspective creates a deep sense of disconnection and alienation from the world around us. When we let go of the grip of the ego, our perception expands. We begin to see not just the me and the world, but the interconnectedness of all beings and all things. In the absence of the ego's narrow focus on self-preservation and self-importance, we can experience life with greater openness, curiosity, and presence. We no longer see ourselves as isolated entities, but as participants in a vast, ever-changing dance of existence, where everything is connected and nothing is truly separate. When we stop labeling experiences as problems, we allow them to exist without the additional weight of mental judgment. The mind's tendency to categorize and judge every situation as either good or bad, right or wrong, creates the illusion of problems. But when we remove these labels, the situation itself often reveals itself to be far less troublesome than we initially believed. The label problem is a construct, an imposition of the mind, not an inherent quality of the situation itself. Take, for instance, a moment of discomfort. It could be a minor inconvenience, like a delay in a plan, or something more significant, like an unexpected challenge at work or in a relationship. The moment we mentally declare it a problem, we amplify its significance. We create an emotional reaction based on the idea that something is wrong, and in doing so, we heighten the sense of struggle. But if we were to simply observe the situation without the label, we may notice that what we're actually experiencing is just a sequence of events, a moment of time, or an interaction devoid of the charged emotional response. This process of labeling often draws from our past experiences, memories, and fears. The mind is quick to pull up old patterns of thought, automatically reacting based on previous similar situations. We project those past experiences onto the present, turning an ordinary challenge into something that feels overwhelming. But when we cease labeling it as a problem, we break free from this conditioned response. We see the situation as it is, a moment of life unfolding, not an obstacle to be feared or fixed. When we encounter something unexpected, perhaps an argument, a setback, or a mistake, we are often quick to define it in negative terms. This shouldn't be happening. This is wrong, but what happens when we stop imposing these judgments? What if we simply allowed the moment to be, without the overlay of mental commentary? We might find that what initially seemed like a problem is simply a part of the ongoing flow of life, something that doesn't need fixing, just experiencing. Without the label of problem, we also free ourselves from the need for control. A problem, by definition, demands a solution, and in the act of seeking that solution, we often create further frustration and stress. But when we drop the label, we stop trying to control the situation or make it conform to our idea of how it should be. Instead of rushing to fix the moment, we allow it to unfold naturally, trusting that it will resolve in its own time, in its own way. By removing the label, we move from a state of resistance to a state of acceptance. Instead of fighting against the flow of life, we align with it. This doesn't mean passivity or inaction, rather. It's an invitation to respond more wisely, with clarity and without the fog of unnecessary worry or judgment. Without the burden of labeling situations as problems, we can approach life with more ease and flexibility, able to see solutions when they arise rather than constantly feeling weighed down by the belief that something is wrong or broken. The real power lies in our ability to see situations as they are without the added narrative. When we stop labeling them as problems, we open up the space for creativity, adaptation, and peace. And in this space, what we once thought of as a problem can simply become part of the flow of life, something to be embraced, understood, or accepted, not fought against. In the end, we come to realize that problems, as we commonly understand them, are not intrinsic to the world. They are constructs of the mind, born from our expectations, judgments, and resistance. When we stop labeling life's events as problems, we open ourselves to a more expansive and peaceful way of experiencing the world. We begin to see that obstacles are merely part of the natural flow of life, not things to be feared or avoided. The stories we tell about our challenges often magnify them, and our ego keeps us focused on a narrow, self-centered perspective, preventing us from seeing the larger picture. But when we let go of these mental constructs, when we stop resisting and labeling, we discover that life, in all its unpredictability, is not something to be fixed, but something to be embraced as it is. The key is not in solving every problem, but in recognizing that life itself, in its raw form, doesn't need fixing. It only needs to be experienced fully, without judgment.